do the welcome.
Hi Leon, how are you doing? What a week.
What a week.
You've been a busy boy.
Well, yeah, I've been running around again, talking to Becky Allen.
Yep.
And actually, I was asked by Michaela to do their live streaming, so I've been in and out with Michaela trying to organise live streaming through their school.
Of course, because we're recording this Friday night and they're having their event tomorrow, aren't they? So you're going to be up early in the morning, ready to do all the techie wizardry for them.
Well, we've got the stream sorted.
So you've got that. I also have done an interview this week, but I did it from the comfort of my sofa. I interviewed Jack Marwood, who is the author of Icing on the Cake blog. He is a primary school teacher, and we had a chat about grammar schools as well, because he's been writing quite a lot about that. But yeah, so it's been busy, been teaching. Year 11s have got their mocks at the moment, so that's fun. But yeah, all good. So I think we should do feedback, because we've had a specific piece of feedback that I think is important to read. You go for it.
So, yeah, I've had some feedback from Gerald Haig. I forget where he gave this to me. It was either on email, or it was Twitter, or it was Facebook. Can't remember. He's on all three anyway.
One thing we do know is it wasn't on our audio feedback mechanism. That we're still waiting to get some feedback through that. But we're determined. We're determined our listeners will do this at some point. Anyway, go on. What's his feedback?
So his feedback is, "Hi Leon, having failed with other media, here's a brief comment on your pilot podcast. I found it interesting enough to make me want more, but I dearly wanted it to cut to the chase. The old journalistic rule kept coming to mind. Tell the whole story in a short para right at the start, then fill in the detail once they're hooked. There were moments when it wasn't certain where you both were headed."
I think that's true.
"But the whole enterprise is to be applauded. We need independent voices."
Oh, Leon, that's brilliant. I love it. So basically what he said is we were waffling. I think we know who's to blame for this, don't we? It's certainly not you.
Mentioning no names.
Well, that's great. There's some advice there that's a positive, a negative, and a positive at the end. I love it. So he found it interesting. Cut to the chase. Here I am, waffling again. We'll cut this bit. Okay. So there was also some feedback from our friend Watonomy, who's a teacher over in Peru.
Is that where he is?
Yeah, he's based in Peru. And he was very pleased to hear teachers talking unmediated on policy. And so the idea that we've got people who are either teachers or experts coming in and having a conversation about policy, basically holding the politicians to account a little bit. It's really good. He liked that aspect of it. And I might be wrong, but I think he quite enjoyed the waffle, so maybe not. Who knows? And we got one last piece, which made me chuckle. This was great. After Mike's review last time, we've got a tweet from Felicity Sandrell, who says, "Please keep Mr. M. Stutchery for carpet time. Loved his book review in episode 1, like listening to a well-informed Russell Crowe." That was brilliant. It made me chuckle.
Yeah, so I think we will do, and we definitely have him lined up for another review, which I'm not going to say what it is, because the book is imminent. But we've also got several other voices, one of whom you will hear today in the middle of the show. In fact, she was the first person to volunteer, and you can hear that a little bit later, Sarah Ledger, who will be talking about her review in the show. So we want to keep Mike, but we do want a variety of voices, not just ones that are London-centric.
So in the spirit of Gerald's feedback, let's just explain to our listeners what we're going to have in the show. First of all, we're going to go through a few blogs and links that we've been collecting. Then we've got our news round section, which I'm afraid has got plenty more tweets from DFE Tweet of the Day Corner. And then we also have Carpet Time, you've already mentioned. Sarah's going to be reviewing her book. And we have a couple of interviews with some brilliant people on grammar schools. So the latter half of our show, we're dedicating to a discussion between ourselves, a couple of interviews that we've done. We'll be finishing off with a little piece of advice from a teacher who is sharing her practice on teaching science to A-level students. So the first thing I want to share, there's been a bit of discussion recently stemming from the kickback from various people on freedom of speech after the US elections and after Brexit, and basically people's right to say what they want seems to have changed. People seem to think that it's okay to start abusing people in bigoted ways and so on. That seems to be the thrust of a change that some people are reporting as seeing. One aspect of that is, how should we be dealing with this in school? Should we be changing our practice to be thinking about how we speak to the students about it in school. I don't want to go into a huge debate about this just now, because I don't think A, we've got time, and B, I think it'd be nice to get a little bit of feedback from other people before we go into that in more details. But there's a link that was shared with me this week called justschoolscollective.com, and it's basically a manifesto for thinking about whether or not we are giving us students enough information about how to deal with issues in the world, political issues in the world, dealing with equality, acceptance, inclusion, justice, all of those sorts of things. It's not launching till 2017, but there's a website there. Just thought it was interesting to have a look at.
Yeah, it's a little bit bare. There's just it's an aspirational page, really.
Sure, absolutely. But when I was reading through it, I thought there was something in there that would help maybe frame this debate. So the second thing I wanted to share was a blog by Mike Cameron. His blog is called Distant Ramblings on the Horizon, and it's cogitations on technology and learning. He's written a post called The Social Contract. The crux of it is, if students are going to be allowed to have phones and they're under a certain age, we really need to think as a society how we're educating our students, whether that's at family level, whether it's the companies who are providing the technology, or whether it's teachers in school. We really need to think about how we're approaching students' responsible use or children's responsible use of technology. It's really, really measured read, well worth a read. So I urge you all to have a read through that blog. So the URL will be in the show notes. Okay.
Okay. Well, what's interesting about that is what I've always said about technology is that it's the affordances of technology, but also this is the affordances in which context, and that's true of anything to do with any tool. Really, you're not going to use a biro to dig a hole, are you? I mean, that's the thing.
It's not, and that's the key thing about this, Leon. It's not critiquing technology per se and the use of it. They have access to all the same technology that we do as adults. Things like age restrictions and so on really are ineffective on the internet. And it's a really good read about the questions that we should maybe ask ourselves at different levels about that. So well worth a read. Okay.
That's our blogs and links. And now we'll move on to the news round. And I think you wanted to say something about the sort of bombshell, really. It's a minor bombshell. Maybe you want to say something about it.
I certainly will. It's our dear friend at Ofsted. Yes, we do have friends at Ofsted, us teachers. Sean Harford is the National Director for Education at Ofsted. He sends out a message to his inspectors, explaining to them if there are any changes to the frameworks of the inspection framework and so on. And he's written a really important letter at the start of his latest piece of information with regards to marking. I'm going to read just a very small part of this. It says this: as I've said before, marking has proved to be one of the harder myths to bust. In part, this has been because we've continued to report on it extensively at some inspections, especially with reference to areas for improvement in previous inspection reports from some time ago. I remain concerned that we continue to see some inspection reporting which gives the impression that more detailed or more elaborate marking is required, or indeed that it is effective in promoting pupils' achievements. Inspectors must not give the impression that marking needs to be undertaken in any particular format or to any particular degree of sophistication or detail. And then he goes on to give references.
Yeah.
He also gives some research references. So he refers to the Teacher Workload Review and the Education Endowment Foundation, their resources on marking, that just goes into the evidence, the research evidence on what the impact is on marking. And it's so refreshing to see that message that says to Ofsted inspectors, please be wary of your language when writing a report, because Sean is accepting that it does have an impact, because other schools read reports that are written about schools in their area or recent Ofsted inspections, and they take the advice that's specific to the context of that school. And quite often we get situations where someone has read an Ofsted report for another school and said, oh, Ofsted are looking for this.
Yeah, so I think every person listening to this podcast should print out that letter and go and put it on the desk of the senior management team as well, because it's where that jumps from the inspection teams to the senior managers.
Absolutely. I think, again, we will put this into the show notes, but it's really, really refreshing to see that. And I think it's really important for all teachers to be aware of what our inspection team, the HMI, Ofsted, what they actually do say and what they do advise their inspectors, because it opened my eyes reading it, just how open Sean was about this. So hats off to the man. He's done a really good job there of just being crystal clear, I think, about what his expectations are. And to help, this is not just to make it easier for inspectors or make it clearer for inspectors, but this is in response to many, many conversations that he's engaged in on Twitter with teachers and school leaders up and down the country who are on social media, who take exception to the idea that another school's report is used as evidence to say that a particular policy should be undertaken in another school. And it's really important that school leaders take responsibility for their own policies and stop worrying about what Ofsted are doing at the school down the road, because every single context is different. Every single school is different. Ofsted are looking at the school as an individual school. They will want to see practice that is pertinent to the context of that school.
So talking about people talking about other people or second guessing what's in other people's heads, I want to move on to sort of Rachel Wolfe, who is a member for the new Advisory Council of Parents and Teachers for Excellence. It's a new group, just been formed. It's a kind of lobbying group. And she was a former special advisor on education to the Prime Minister, and she went away to the States and did a bit with trying to push laptops in schools for Rupert Murdoch, and then she's returned back. And now she's involved in this sort of lobbying group for excellence in education. And she seems to be speaking for the parents or at grassroots level. Whether that is the case or not, there is a desire to take the education debate to ordinary parents. And this is something that runs throughout the thread of this week's show. And
absolutely,
what got me was that she started up this, and she's had a whole sort of article on this, again in the show notes. But it's interesting that she is married. So yes, she's married to James Frayne, and she's listed. James Frayne was a lobbyist for Michael Gove, and he likes to keep a very low profile. And his claim to fame was that he is one of the people who pioneered the use of what's grassroots people power campaigns. It's called astroturfing. And the reason it's called astroturfing is because, unlike real grassroots, it's fake astroturf. Did you get the
I
metaphor?
get the link.
The metaphor.
Even me on a Friday night gets that link.
So he's claimed to successfully lobbied against government plans to increase taxes and regulation on businesses by positioning ordinary people against elites. There we go. It's your 12 o'clock cuckoo.
I must say to listeners, if we do keep this bit in, it isn't 12 o'clock. Leon and I aren't recording this at midnight. My daughters have changed the time on my cuckoo clock. So I'll just talk through the cuckoo. So James, this is pertinent, I think, Leon, to what we're talking about later. I don't want to make a big thing of it just now, but we are thinking about the impact that parental wishes are having on education policy. And I think to have a group that are purporting to speak for parents about, and specifically in the article that you've highlighted, Rachel's talking about what goes on in the classroom. So she's saying we want to move from structures. We want to think about what's going on in the classroom, think about teaching practice. And there's been a lot of reframing of education discussion about, it's not about structures, it's about what goes on in the classroom. So very interesting that people think that there needs to be a lobbying group about what goes on in the classroom. They're talking about testing in that article. They're talking about marking and basically the practice of teaching. Now, I'm not going to make a comment just now about whether I think that this is going to be a valid valid input into the debate about how we teach and so on. And I want to wait and see. But I am, as you say, if this is astroturfing in quotes, then we need to be just aware on how these ideas get promoted. Another piece of news that we've seen this week, I've just seen it today, is the ITT recruitment figures are out. The ITT recruitment is low again for the shortage subjects. Physics is sitting at 81%, so we're a fifth down on the number of teachers that we need joining the profession, and computing is down at below 70%, so that's almost a third down on what we need. So 2/3 of the trainees that we need to fulfil our computing teaching needs, 4/5 of the trainees that we need to do our physics. Maths is faring a little bit better at 84%, and English is near to 100%. Primary, thankfully, 100%. So sad news again for these shortage subjects. Physics and computing traditionally down at the bottom there, with maths as well. So not good news.
And that leads on again to the DFE's Twitter tweets week on week, which also claim
I love them.
Certain
I
things.
keep thinking of a better name. I'm still going to call this DFE tweet of the week for the moment, for want of a better.
I think there's been two
but
this week.
They've had a few. I've noticed actually, because I've been reading the transcript to the Education Select Committee on grammar schools, that these stats are basically from the first paragraph of Nick Gibbs' response to this, where he's asked in the Education Select Committee what, I'm paraphrasing, but what evidence is there for selective schools? And he responds with about 4 or 5 pieces of evidence that have now found their way onto the DFE Twitter feed as lovely little images with bits in bold and so on. And I'll be honest, I'm less than impressed. But that's just let's take one of them.
Well, the latest one is the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and their peers is virtually eliminated in selective schools. Asterisk. We want more places at selective schools for the brightest disadvantaged pupils.
Now, I don't think we need to go into this too much, because Becky, Alan and Jack discuss some aspects of this later on. But there's 2 points I want to just very quickly make. First point to make about that is whether or not the data that they use, whether or not they've got enough information about disadvantaged pupils. The number of disadvantaged pupils, if we use free school meals as an example, is so low that there's a lot of noise in that data. So again, there's tweet number one.
Yeah, I mean it's mistaking noise for signal. It's pretending noise is signal and it isn't signal.
It certainly could be, absolutely. And last week's was I loved it. Me and Jack had a good chuckle about this during our interview. Selective schools are almost 50% more popular than non-selective schools when comparing a parent's first preference for their child.
Well, when I showed that to ask Becky about that, we just looked at each other and laughed, really. I mean, that's about the tone of that how people can take it.
Yeah, I spoke to Jack about it and we had the same. His response was, that's barely statistics, you know. Look, 50% more popular than non-selective schools. Are they talking about in a selective area? Because if they are, I am surprised that number is so low. Because you would expect that the selective schools would be wildly more popular than non-selective schools because of all the other information that we've been talking about. The fact that the disadvantaged students who haven't passed their 11 plus are the ones that have to go to the non-selective schools in that area would imply that most people are going to want their kids to go to the selective school, whether they get in or not. They're going to prefer that because they see in that area that school gets the best results in that area.
Yeah, I don't want to labour the point, but they go into this really, really deeply in the interviews, which you have to listen to.
Absolutely.
The interesting thing is that they have been wrapped over the knuckles by the UK Statistics Authority.
Yep.
And and you are getting people now saying, why are you doing this again and again? Because they are skirting very close to the edge with, let's say, these little missives that are coming out on Twitter, and it kind of looks to me it's what I would call a charm offensive for parents. And I think really there needs to be some kickback on this from everyone, because basically you just can't pull the wool over everyone's eyes like this and then ask people to fill in a consultation. And there have been some questions about the consultation document, in that this week Schools Week managed to fill in on the survey on grammar schools 2 bits. One, they pretended to be Ebenezer Scrooge and they didn't fit anything in because they didn't want to skew the survey. And then they came out and they went back in with the same IP address and went in as Jacob Marley as well. So
so they're saying from the same source,
yes.
You can send in multiple.
Yes.
You can send in multiple requests or multiple responses.
And it says the survey isn't really canvassing parental opinion because it assumes the proposals are uncontested. And
Absolutely.
It's biased. It has been linked to misinformation and makes it too easy to submit multiple fictitious responses. So it can't be regarded as a genuine consultation, and it's a sham. Well, that's according to local schools. You'd have to make your own mind up reading the information and the data on that. But I think it's important.
Yeah, so the letter from the Statistics Authority was fascinating because it picked up points that we've made as well, which is that the tweets seem to be misusing statistics, misusing categories of data, and they are, I mean, the words that they say, they're disappointed that the department has published it in this form. They see that the press office has withdrawn the tweet and did so quickly once the issue was identified. It was withdrawn. It was then reissued, and then it was withdrawn again. So that was the tweet that we were talking about last time, the appearing and disappearing and reappearing and disappearing tweet. Brilliant that the Statistics Authority are picking them up on this.
Yeah, I'd call them Cheshire Cat tweets because, only the grins left.
We're still talking about them, aren't we?
So let's move on to a part of the show. It's enough of us, and we'll move on to the review.
Carpet time.
Carpet time. So I hope you're all settling down on your carpet and listening to Sarah Ledger, who reviews Shakespeare on Toast, Getting a Taste with a Bard by Ben Crystal.
My name's Sarah Ledger. I'm reviewing Ben Crystal's Shakespeare on Toast, published by Icon Books. It's on sale at $8.99 in paperback. I need to apologise for the sound quality. Like a lot of teachers, on a Friday afternoon, I'm sitting in an empty classroom. I'm not at the bottom of a well, but actually, for some of you listening to this, that might really enhance the ambience, so I'm not really going to apologise for it. Shakespeare on Toast is a very lively, entertaining book about a practical approach to Shakespeare. For Ben Crystal, the key to understanding Shakespeare is understanding Shakespeare's time and his industry, understanding Shakespeare's theatre. I came across this book at a book festival earlier in the year where Ben was presenting his work with his father, David Crystal, who'll be a familiar name to many of you. He's an English language A-level guru and a grammar guru, and together they've done a great deal of work on Shakespeare. They've produced a couple of books together, Shakespeare's Words and the Shakespeare Miscellany, and they've worked together on original pronunciation. They've researched the way that Shakespeare's language was pronounced in the 16th and 17th century. And Ben has actually performed a number of plays using original pronunciation. He does touch on that in this book, but what this book is really about finding a way through the metre that Shakespeare uses and some of the soliloquies that he writes. Ben Crystal argues that Shakespeare's work is not inaccessible. He claims that 95% of Shakespeare's language are words that are still in current use, everyday use, and he's all about breaking down the barriers. There's a great deal of information in the book that probably, I would imagine, experienced English teachers probably know about, but I did really like the enthusiasm that he brought to the whole idea of teaching Shakespeare in the context of Shakespeare's plays, and the way that Shakespeare worked and the way that Shakespeare's work was published. He goes through the history of the publication of Shakespeare's work in a very accessible way. I think this would be a really useful book to freshen up some ideas about teaching Shakespeare, but also it's a good book, I think, if you were looking for a book to inspire some high-attaining Year 10s and 11s or maybe sixth formers. It will be a very good book to use and point your students in a certain direction. I think it would also be a useful book to recommend to high-attaining Year 10 and 11 students who are preparing for the new GCSE, and also for sixth formers. It might just give them that little bit of fresh insight into the way that Shakespeare's words are spoken and performed. For me, I found the most interesting parts were to do with understanding and applying metre and looking at Shakespeare's innovation with writing in iambic pentameter. For me, that was new information, and it certainly made me look at the way I was teaching Shakespeare in a slightly different light. There's always the tired old trope of anybody who writes or talks about Shakespeare telling you that they're giving you a new insight, that, yeah, everybody thinks Shakespeare's boring, but no, it's not, and this is how it's going to be done, and this is a better way of teaching it. And I have to say, Ben Crystal does do a bit of that, but I can forgive him because there is a genuine passion there, and there is genuine knowledge and genuine little flecks of insight that might be really, really helpful to inform a lesson or an understanding of a play. If you're not an English teacher, it's just an interesting book to read, and I thoroughly recommend it.
So that was Carpet Time by Sarah Ledger, but now we're going to talk a little bit about who we talked to this week and go in more depth on grammars. So would you like to say a bit about your talk with Jack Marwood?
Okay, so yeah, I spoke with Jack Marwood, who's a primary school teacher and a statistician, about his thoughts on selective schools. We got a longer interview with him, but here's just a few of his thoughts on the grammar school debate.
So my name is Jack Marwood, at least my pseudonym is, and I've worked in primary schools for 10, 15 years now. I started writing about education about 3 years ago now. I started a blog, and then I've written various things for Schools Week, TES, The Guardian. But I've taken an interest of late in the grammar schools debate because it's obviously become a live issue for us all.
And so recently you've had a few interactions with Peter Hitchens, who has been making the case that grammar schools should be allowed because there's a problem at the moment with middle-class parents buying up houses near schools so they can get into the good schools. All the good schools basically have for sale signs around them, and the housing market is dictating who gets to go to which schools. I effectively paraphrasing his remarks. So, Peter, if you're listening, if I've got this argument slightly wrong, I do apologise. Please ring in and we'll have you on to make your case. But
I picked up a conversation with Peter where he was basically arguing that we lack academically good schools which are open to children whose parents aren't rich. So that was his argument, and I thought this was an interesting thing to say, so I kind of picked him up on that and said, I don't think that that's true. But basically his argument is that if you want to get into a good school, you need to buy a house next to that school, and that's a bad thing. And he argues that selection by wealth is a bad thing, and that selection by ability is better. It turned out that Theresa May had said pretty much the same thing when she was talking about grammar schools. She was saying that we've had selection by house price, selection by wealth for too long, which is basically Peter Hitchens' phrase. So I looked into it. It turns out that Peter Hitchens wrote a piece for Civitas in 2015 where he basically said, why is selection by wealth better than selection by ability? Now, again, when you listen to those two phrases, the thing that annoyed me to start with was that he was equating the two, suggesting they were two sides of the same coin. And that, I don't think, is the case, because I think that selection by ability is clearly something that's done by schools in a selective system. He argues that the schools are selecting by wealth. And his argument is along the lines that a shop like Harrods selects its customers by wealth. Now, I don't think that's true. I think that what happens is that a shop like Harrods positions itself in the marketplace and people decide whether they shop there or not. But the shop isn't choosing who shops there in the same way that a school isn't selecting who applies to it. So if you're in a non-selective grammar comprehensive, you're not selecting your children. Your children are that's a different thing. It's been done by the parents. It's not been done by the school. Now, it sounds like a bit of a semantic point, But it is important, when we're talking about the difference between what we currently have and what we could have with the grammar school system, the two things would be very different, I think. Mm-hmm. They're not two sides of the same coin.
So let's just have a quick think about the Harrods analogy, because as you were saying it, I was thinking, I've been to Harrods. I've bought a pack of biscuits because I wasn't willing to spend any more money than that. So exactly. Harrods does...
It has a great food hall, by the way. You should go there
sometime.
But again,
I've
only
seen
to buy a sandwich. You're not buying a hamper.
Absolutely. So for me, maybe Harrods does price people out the market from the point of view of there will be people who might go into Harrods and buy nothing more than a pack of biscuits. They're not Harrods customers, even though they've had some custom, if you see what I mean. That's maybe the equivalent of saying a kid going to a grammar school playing field to go and play sports, for example. But however, I don't know that the Harrods analogy can be passed on to a school because it's not the school that's charging that money. A school has a location which may have a high value housing market around it, but it doesn't have
This is the argument. That is the argument which I had with Peter Hitchens to basically say, I don't think your analogy works because, that's not what's happening. He said, no, there is selection by wealth. Schools select by wealth because you can only afford to live nearby. And I think this is a muddying of the waters. And I think that it's a dangerous argument. So I had that initial discussion with him about selection by wealth. And again, once I made my point, and he kind of said, well, you see, but you're wrong because there clearly is selection by wealth. And then I had, having reflected on that and thought about that, I wrote another piece to say, yep, you're quite right. There is selection by wealth. And there is selection by house price. And people do buy houses to get close to schools so they can get their children into those schools. But the more I reflected on that, the more I thought, actually, I think that's a really good thing because the way in which we've looked at education for the last 25 years, is that we've tried to provide a good education for all, and we've tried to give parents some element of choice in the school which their children go to. Mm-hmm. Now, people complain about the preference system that we have for primary and secondary, but actually you can express a preference. You can say, I want my child to go to this school. But more than that, you can express a preference by moving near a school which you want to put your children into. Mm-hmm. Most people, before they have children, don't live near schools because they're not living the kind of life which requires them to live in a suburban
You're talking to somebody who moved house before I had any children. I moved house just before my daughter was born, and one of the criteria for choosing this house was it was next to a small, good school, and it wasn't the sole reason we picked the house, but it factored into it. Before I was having children, I wouldn't be worried about living near a school. But
and I think that's the case for the vast majority of people. Now, admittedly, it's not all people because there are a lot of people whose circumstances are such that they don't have that kind of choice.
Yeah, they don't have the choice.
But even then, we know that the children who move around the most within the school system, they're not the rich children.
No.
The children who move around with the school system are children who tend to be less well off. So again, this argument that it's only the rich who get the choice. Well, you don't. You can choose. If you live somewhere and you don't like where you live, you can up sticks and move. In the school which I teach in, we have children moving in from outside of the city which I teach in all the time. It happens, and people can make those decisions anyway. So the argument which I think is that if you want to, you can move, and most people do that, and I think that's a good thing because at least you're then expressing a preference for the school, and that works in two ways. It gives the parents the benefit of having some say in where their child's going to go to school. Mm-hmm. And it also has the benefit of putting pressure on schools because then schools know that they need to offer something which appeals to parents. Mm-hmm. Now, admittedly, the richer you are, the more choice you've got.
Yeah.
But, that's the economic system under which we live. The more cash you've got, the more choice of car you've got. So it is. But most people can afford a runaround. And, the more cash you've got, the more exclusive a school you can afford to do. But most people can afford a typical school. You can find an average school. Yes, some schools have super selective catchment areas based on bottom wealth, but that's probably been the case forever. If you want to go live in a really expensive bit of, I don't know, Oxford or London, they've been really expensive for a very long time. So the second argument, which I said was, and I still think this, that there is selection by wealth. There clearly is, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it has to be a good thing. We've had 5-6 years of the current government-ish, with the Lib Dems before, arguing strongly that we should have excellent schools for everybody. Mm-hmm. And this idea that we should move to excellent schools, however you define those, just for a few people, I think is very worrying.
This is the thing. The tack has changed, definitely. DfE have changed tack, or the government have changed tack. I think the DFE were caught out somewhat. They're still using similar language. They are saying good schools for all. It's just ironic because they want the same outcome, or they're saying they want the same outcome, but their methodology has changed. So instead of saying, well, we want all schools to become academies, which was what they were hoping would improve all schools, is they're saying, well, we want to introduce selection, and that will mean that it's good schools for all. So they're basically, I think their intended outcome, stated outcome, is the same, in that they want to improve schooling for everybody, but their methodology, they've changed tack on how they're going to get there. Instead of sailing one direction to try and get there, they're going close to shore. They can,
and I think it's a bit suspect. I mean, people have made all kinds of observations about, is it a dead cat maneuver where you throw a dead cat on the table to get everybody to look at that? To distract us from many other issues the country is facing.
I don't know what you mean.
So it could be that, and it could also be the fact that the Department of Education doesn't seem to be, as much as we can see, they're not quite as in control of the brief as they were previously, because number 10 is making decisions, for all kinds of reasons. Nick Timothy, who was part of the New Schools Network, is now a major advisor for Theresa May, and so on. So there's all those things.
The landscape, the SPAD landscape has changed.
I think the other thing is that they're also kind of throwing something out to traditional conservative voters of saying grammar schools, we should have more of those, because we know that a lot of people think that grammar schools are a great idea.
And of course, it was one of the selling points that UKIP went for. They were saying
we should have more grammar schools. A lot of people think that. A lot of people think we should have more grammar schools.
I will come back to your blog post and a little bit more discussion on that, but that leads us quite nicely into the tweet that was sent out by the DFE. The tweet said something along these lines.
Is this the tweet from this week? Yes.
This is this week's tweet.
There've been some doozies coming from the DFE.
I tell you what, they are
as good.
They are keeping me in business. No, right, so I love this. It's great. It's just kind of appeared, this idea that we can critique the DFE's latest statistical blunders. So
fantastic.
Anyway, their tweet says selective schools are almost 50% more popular than non-selective schools. They're saying that is when comparing a parent's first preference for their child. Okay? They've got the statistics, they've got the link, they've got a little publication.
I have to stop you there because, I'm a statistician.
Go for it.
The whole idea that that's a statistic, you're just like, no, it's just a made-up figure. The problem with it is that in order for you to really understand quite how ridiculous it is, there's a whole bunch of other information you need to understand about the way which selection works and so on. And it is, so, for example, if you live in Kent, which has got the most grammar schools that still exist, and if you want to apply for a grammar school, you have to take the 11 plus, which hilariously, the euphemism they use there is the Kent test. But basically, you take the 11 plus, and you do that in Kent. So loads of children take the 11 plus, and then you get a mark, and that mark tells you whether you can get into, whether you then pass the Kent test, whether you pass the 11 plus. So then you're eligible for a grammar school place, and then after that, then you have to apply for a school. For a grammar school. So lots of people, of course, do that. Your child passes the test, then you apply for the grammar school. There's about 5,000 grammar school places available. So then loads of people apply for those places. But you can appeal if your child didn't pass, if they failed 11 plus, and you want to appeal that and say, well, even though my child failed the test, I still think they should get a place in a grammar school. If you want to do that, then you have to name a grammar school on the form.
Right.
So you have to apply for a grammar school, even though there's no possibility of you getting in. So that increases the number of people who apply for places in Kent. Added to which, because Kent has grammar schools and because they're super selective and because people, lay people like the idea of grammar schools, so loads of people from outside of Kent apply for schools. So there's just over 4,000 children from Kent have passed the test, but there's another 2,000, 2 and a bit thousand people from outside of Kent who've passed the test as well, because they're allowed to take it. So there's something like 7,000 children who've passed the Kent test who apply for these 5,000 places. And then there's all these people who are borderline, and I don't know how many of those are. I've looked into it, but let's assume that there's 8,000, 9,000. I don't know. I mean, they said 50% more likely. I don't know. Maybe there's 7,500, 8,000 people apply for the 5,000 places.
Sure.
I don't know. Anyway, but either way, you're not comparing like with like. It's very, very different. Again, it's one of those things where you've just looked at a whole bunch of numbers and you've chosen one which seems to suit your argument. But if you look closely, it all falls apart. In Kent, the majority of the grammar schools, guess what? They select by house price as well.
Yeah.
Because you can apply for the school. If you've passed the Kent test, you're eligible for the school.
But you still
so
got
after
to live
they've gone through their criteria, it's still closest to school gets in. So it's still selection by house price. So again, if you're a parent in Kent and you think your kid's quite smart, so you've probably tutored them to death as well. So anyway, they've passed the 11 plus and you have moved next to the grammar school which you want your child to go into, you can probably get your kid into that school. Your child can probably go into that school. So even in Kent, where they have selection by ability, it's selection by ability and selection by wealth. It's flannel of the highest order.
And that was Jack Marwood. The fact that he's a primary school teacher who is a statistician is a very rare bird indeed. Probably one of one in the whole country, or one of five maybe. And that's why he's interesting to listen to, because he's able to sort of get under the hood. Very much like Becky. Becky is when I went down to the Education Data Lab, she's the director of that, and she's an expert in analysis of large-scale administrative and survey data sets. And that includes the pupil database and school workforce census. And what her research explores is the impact of government reforms on school behaviour and their accountability and teacher labour markets. So she is one of the best people placed to talk about the data to do with grammar schools. And here's a short excerpt of the interview I did with Becky. Now, I'm with Becky Allen at the Education Data Lab in London. Unfortunately, we've chosen one of the days where it's become a bit like a building site around us. There's bandsaws going, the inevitable London bandsaw if you do an interview or a video. But we'll persevere. Thank you, Becky, for agreeing to do this interview.
It's a pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about Education Data Lab and what your role in it is at the moment?
So my background is that after I left teaching, I became an academic. I went and did a PhD. I'm an economist by training, and I went off to work at the Institute of Education. And I still have an academic post there, but I wanted to take some time out, a period of leave, to try doing things a bit differently. So I'd always done quantitative research on schools with the aim of providing some sort of narrative on whether government policy was working or not. But we wanted to set up Education Data Lab to try working in a slightly different way, to be more responsive to the policy environment and engage much more with schools directly in helping them to make sense of the policy landscape and also the data that they get on how they're doing in schools. So that's the background to how we set up. We're part of the Fisher Family Trust, and that is really integral to how we work, simply because we largely use the massive administrative data sets on pupils and on teachers, and the Fisher Family Trust maintains these databases, so we have a really, really lovely, secure data environment to work in, and that means we can work very, very fast when we do analysis, because all the data is ready there and it's cleaned and it's been prepared for us to use.
So what do we know at the moment about generally the stats to do with grammar schools?
So I should start by just saying, well, it's really hard to know what the impact of grammar schools is, because for every child who lives in Kent who goes to a grammar school in secondary modern, we can't at the same time create a parallel universe where we put them through the comprehensive system and find out what happens to them. So we spend our time in the data trying to find people who look exactly like those people who are going through a grammar school system. And we have, broadly speaking, when we talk about the impact, we have two big sets of literature that looks at this. And one is the literature for people who went through grammar schools really quite a long time ago now. So a group of people who, for the most part, they were born in 1958. They were a birth cohort, which means that we tracked them from birth. We still track them now at the Institute of Education, and we know a lot about them. And some of them went through a comprehensive system, some went through a grammar school system. It was a time of reform, actually, so some went through a mixture of both. And we learned something about what happened to them. And the reason why I think it's important that we still talk about them is that because we know everything about their family background, we can be quite confident about what the impact of having gone to a grammar school is. The second reason it's important to talk about them is they've been around long enough that we can say what the true impact is on your long-term life chances of different types of education systems. So we can see their earnings, for example. So that's one group that we talk about. And the other group we talk about are the children today who go through a grammar school because they live in Kent and Medway, in Buckinghamshire or in Lincolnshire. And we particularly like to talk about these massive selective local authorities because where there are individual standalone grammar schools, it's very hard for us to locate the impact of them because the children who go to them come from all over the place, and it's not clear where the counterpart, the places where the people who fail the 11 plus end up. So these people are really interesting to us because they tell us what modern day grammar schools are like, but the downside is we don't know much about them. We know their SATs data, their key stage data, and that's about it. And we don't know what happens to them in the long run yet because we haven't matched into data sets that tell us about their earnings. But roughly speaking, all of this literature pretty much says the same thing, which is that going to a grammar school is good. You're better off than you would be at a comprehensive school. When we say, well, how much better off? We're less sure how much better off, but it's probably quite a bit. So managing to get into a grammar school compared to going to a comprehensive school could raise your GCSE outcomes by as much as something like a third of a grade per subject. And that's a really, really big benefit. And then we say, well, what about people who fail the 11 plus, who go to secondary moderns? Well, the literature says mostly that's not a great thing to happen compared to getting to go to a comprehensive school. And they say, well, how bad? They say, well, not very bad at all. Something like, it might be really tiny effect, like let's say 10% of a grade. But the problem is that grammar schools create lots of people who fail the 11 plus and end up in secondary moderns. So then when we say, well, what's the overall impact? We can say, well, there's quite a big gain for a very small number of children, and there's a very small loss for a big number of children. So overall, is that a system you would like? Well, that's actually your value judgment on whether that's the kind of redistribution of outcomes you want to see in society.
What about the impact of grammar schools in areas with weak schools? Nick Gibb talked about bringing the DNA of grammar schools into sort of weaker. Can they improve those areas? I mean, is there a case to be made there?
So, let's talk about Knowsley, for example, because it's talked about so much in the education press as an example of a place where the education system, as it is, a relatively small number of secondary schools, simply hasn't improved. And Nick Gibb's response to that was, well, we've tried everything and we can't make the schools there get better, so why not throw grammar schools into the mix? I think the response to that would have to be, what do you think is actually likely to happen in Knowsley if you do that? So say you create one grammar school for every 5 non-grammar schools. Who do you think is going to be going to those schools? Well, one thing we know about Knowsley at the moment is that there are lots of students with more motivated parents who currently leave Knowsley to go to secondary schools elsewhere. So our best guess is that Knowsley grammar schools don't necessarily get filled up by children who live in Knowsley. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's what you kind of see across the country. So we talk about the Trafford grammar schools and how fantastic they are. Well, they might be not. But what's true is that they're not educating the children of Trafford. There's a very large part of Trafford where not a single child in the last 5 years has gone to a Trafford grammar school. And they're serving a very, very wide part of the greater Manchester area. So our best guess is that something similar is likely to happen in Knowsley as a result. Which is not to say that the Knowsley secondary schools themselves won't lose any pupils at all. But then we ask the question, well, what pupils do they lose? And more importantly, what teachers might they lose? They might be losing their high-attaining, most motivated pupils, which you may think in itself has a damaging impact on the secondary schools that will then become de facto secondary moderns. Mm-hmm. But they may also be losing particular types of teachers. One of the things that we can see happening in areas like Kent is that there are great inequalities in the kind of teachers who teach in grammar schools compared to secondary moderns. So in grammar schools you are far less likely to have teachers who are unqualified. You've got much larger numbers of teachers who've been qualified for 10 years or more, so very experienced teachers. Your churn of teachers in grammar schools is very low.
Oh, right.
You're much more likely in a grammar school compared to a secondary modern to be taught by a teacher who has an academic degree in the subject that they're teaching. This is particularly pronounced in subjects like physics, in science in general, and in maths. So these inequalities that ultimately become social inequalities in who gets access to high-quality, suitable teachers become very pronounced where you have academic selection, grammar schools and secondary moderns. Which is not to say that these social inequalities don't happen across the country. You know, we all know that vacancy rates are higher in schools that serve more disadvantaged communities, that these schools struggle to recruit, they have fewer people applying for jobs, and that the same patterns that I've described of having non-specialist teaching subjects you see in more disadvantaged schools. The question is just to what extent do those social inequalities get more pronounced within selective systems? And our evidence is that they really do. And so that's my greatest concern, is if we introduce a grammar school to Knowsley, it may or may not be great for the children who get to go, but what we do know is, by its very definition, the majority of children in Knowsley will not get to go. And what happens to them? I don't think it's reasonable for us to assume that everything is just the same for those children. And we may say, well, things are not great at the moment in Knowsley schools. Actually, I've never visited them. I don't know what they're like. But it is possible they could get a lot worse. And I think we have to consider that possibility in the grammar school policy.
That's interesting. Can you tell people about Progress 8? Because, I mean, there's a vast swathe of teachers, especially in primary, who don't understand what it is. And to compare that with secondary moderns, and is there a bias there?
So Progress 8... takes two children who've got exactly the same Key Stage 2 scores at the end of secondary school, and it asks who does the best at GCSE. And it's counting up the GCSEs you get across your 8 best GCSEs, but they have to include maths and English. 3 of them have to be EBAC subjects. So what you're always doing is making these comparisons between children who have the same Key Stage 2 scores. Now, early on we pointed out, and others have pointed out since, that there's a social gradient on Progress 8. And what that means is that schools that serve more affluent communities are likely to have better Progress 8 scores than schools that serve more disadvantaged communities. And at first glance that doesn't seem logical, because we're measuring progress, not attainment, and we think it should therefore be fair, because the schools that serve more disadvantaged communities should have lower attaining children and therefore have less expectation for final GCSE results. The problem arises because if we've got two children who have the same Key Stage 2 scores, but we see that one goes to a very affluent school and one goes to a very disadvantaged school, even though they appear to have the same Key Stage results, we know that they're different. We know that they're different because they're going to different kinds of schools, and we know that in all likelihood they've got very different types of families and very different home environments. They may actually have different academic capabilities that haven't been measured by the SATs. And so it's for that reason that you don't really see any grammar schools that have negative Progress 8 scores.
Right.
And it's hard for schools that have very, very disadvantaged intakes to achieve positive Progress 8 scores. Now, there's a particular problem that goes on with the grammar schools and the secondary moderns that's an example of this, I guess. So a grammar school, on the whole, has children who have very high Key Stage 2 scores. Typically, to get into a grammar school, you're going to have a Key Stage 2 score on the old metric that's above 5, well above 5, so a fine grade of 5.1, 5.2 or higher. And yet, when we look at grammar school data, there's always these children in grammar schools that have low Key Stage scores. Some of them are amazingly low. So you'll have a child that has something like a Key Stage 2 fine grade of 4.3, 4.4. This is on the face of it a low attaining 11-year-old, and yet we know for a fact they passed the 11 plus. So the question is, which is the truer measure of their academic capabilities and their attainment at the age of 11? Is it the 11 plus, or is it this SAT score, this Key Stage 2 score that we can observe? What we see with these children is that when they go to grammar school, they appear to make amazing progress, so that they have really great GCSE results. Now that gives us a clue that probably the SATs data, the Key Stage data, just was not accurate. The consequence of that is that we then assign amazingly high progress of these very low Key Stage 2 attaining children who go to grammar schools to the grammar school, and we say that is your benefit, right, and that's your progress, right, when in fact probably all the progress was being made at primary school and they are wrongly picking it up. And then for secondary moderns, the reverse is true, in the sense that there are children with incredibly high Key Stage 2 scores living in a place like Kent, a fully selective area, and we see them at a secondary modern school, which suggests to us that they have probably, in all likelihood, failed the 11 plus. And again, so they go on and they appear to not do as well as other very high attaining children at GCSE. Now, the system, Progress 8, says, well, that's because the secondary modern didn't do well for them. But we're concerned, and I think in all likelihood, it's the case that their Key Stage 2 scores were overstating how academically able they actually were at the age of 11.
And you have the other thing that's saying it's popular with parents, 50% more popular in terms of first preference choices than other schools. I mean, what's your reaction to that? I mean,
well, The more interesting question is actually, are these popular with the public? And the data's more equivocal on that, I think. So there's two dimensions to the data, and one is the age dimension. I think, roughly speaking, shows that the public on average is not in favour of grammar school expansion, just about, but that older people are in favour of grammar school expansion.
Well, that's interesting, because their parents more or less reacted against the system in the earlier stages, in the 60s and 70s, because it was falling apart, surely, historically. That was the case.
So they did. So then we have to get into this debate about why are we in a situation where we are thinking of recreating something that collectively as a society, Conservatives and Labour, decided wasn't working for us. And I don't think it's just the case that we're doing it because we've forgotten what 11 plus selection's like, although I think we have. I think there are other factors at play here, and I think one of the factors at play is that some people are disappointed at how the comprehensive experiment has worked out and have watched their children go through comprehensive schools, having been through a grammar or secondary modern themselves, and haven't been happy with the quality of education and the experience that their own children have had. The promise of the comprehensive experiment was that we would have grammar schools for all. And I think people feel that didn't happen. And I suppose for people who are campaigning against grammar schools and in favour of a comprehensive system, I think they have to have a good hard look at why people who went through the schooling system feel that way about the schooling experience that they had.
Well, I mean, you talk about certain data like good teaching, people who've got a good academic background, those elements that were within the grammar schools. I mean, is it worth thinking about transplanting that into other schools rather than it just being this system of selection and in? I mean, is there an alternate way?
So historically, grammar schools were different in very practical ways from secondary moderns because they actually provided a different curriculum leading to a different set of qualifications. Whereas what we're proposing now isn't really that we're planning on doing anything different to the children that we're planning on putting into grammar schools. So we're planning on taking a set of children and putting them to grammar schools, and yet nothing different will necessarily happen to them. So I think the word grammar schools is being used as a proxy for something quite different, which is a traditional academic curriculum in an ordered environment with strict behaviour and discipline, where children can feel safe, where children can feel valued even if they're very intelligent and they want to work hard. And I think that some parents feel it's not possible for children to go through a comprehensive system and feel like that.
And also you've got this sort of, I don't know where it came from, it didn't come from left field, but Tim Loyner talked about the Dutch system and this tripart system the tripart system here didn't work many years ago either. I mean, the technical colleges were few, and you have the UTCs here now, which are sort of struggling in terms of numbers. I mean, how do you feel about that in terms of any data coming out?
I think his suggestion that we should stratify children and decide what sorts of jobs they deserve to have in life at the age of 11 or 12 is actually quite abhorrent. I think it's worse than the proposed grammar school system, where at least in secondary moderns we're giving people access to a general academic curriculum that gives them choices about the kind of person they want to be in life. And that they are able to function in society as a citizen like everybody else. So I am deeply against any sort of system that shuts down choices for children early on.
So if we compare some of the points from both of those interviews, both Becky and Jack, I think, are very clear that there's a difference between trying to talk about this dry stats, which, Nick Gibb said himself in his evidence to the Education Committee on grammar schools. He's saying that, there's the effect on grammar schools and other schools in the area. So there are some reports that say there are no adverse effects on the non-grammar schools in those areas, but he admits that the evidence is mixed. There's plenty of evidence to say that it does have an impact. Becky Allen was saying that there was only 2.5% eligible for free school meals in grammar schools. So in areas that they're located, she said that the free school meal entitlement is 9%. So the weight of disadvantaged students that are in grammar schools versus the ones that aren't, we're not comparing like with like.
Well, no, because obviously there's so few grammar schools and so many other schools. There's a huge diversity. So it's a thing of scale as well. It's a bias of scale in that sense. But the other thing she said was that grammar schools attract a really good teacher who's got a very good academic background and who've been in job for a long time. So they're embedded in that school. And when Ofsted comes along, of course they do well fantastically. Of course they are really doing well because there's very little churn. People know their stuff. They can get on and they can teach. And that is not so prevalent in other schools, whether they're around grammar schools, secondary moderns, or in other areas,
especially disadvantaged areas.
So where are you going to sort of that might be a pointer to how that might take things forward. But where are you going to get that workforce from?
This is the law of unintended consequences, basically rearing its ugly head. I do not doubt that Nick Gibb is trying to raise the standards of schools for all. That's what they're saying they want to do. I'm sure that is what they're hoping to do. But by offering by giving the offer of grammar schools in an area where grammar schools are no longer a part of the educational mix. So, for example, if we were to bring a grammar school back into York, for example, we don't know what the consequences of that are going to be. They seem to be convinced that the consequence is going to be positive. I really think it depends entirely on the area, entirely on the...
Well, it's not only the area. I went to grammar school in the 60s and I had to travel 5 to 7 miles every day to get to the grammar school. So I was coming from outside of the area into that grammar school. That's the other point. You will have children coming from all parts flocking into that grammar school. It's not necessarily the local area as well. So if you're in a very disadvantaged area, you may find children from all over the place being sucked in to the magnet, And as far as I'm concerned, I've got no doubt as well that Nick Gibb is trying to do this, but he seems to be doing it through a sort of trying to run a sort of 100 yards dash in a sack with this policy. To be quite honest, if I'm brutally honest, people really do need to think about that.
There's an issue with, as I was saying before, with dry stats and thinking about what parents want. There's a conversation that myself and Jack had that I'll play just now, where I was explaining to him an interaction I had with a gentleman on a train going down to London. Except in this tweet, this is the first tweet where they've been talking about what parents think and what parents want. And this comes on to the conversation that I had with a gentleman on the train. I was going down to Research Ed back in September. Managed to get an upgrade to first class, because I don't think I'd have been having this particular conversation, had I not been sat in first class. And he was asking me what I thought about the grammar schools. And I asked him as well. And his response just made me realise there's two ways of tackling this. The nerdy way that we've been discussing about the fact that the stats just do not show, they show no benefit of grammar schools. And we'll come back to a point that I think you'd made and you've been looking at in a second. That's one side of it. The other side of it is, what do parents want for their kids? This guy he said to me, look, I send my kids to private school. I've paid for their education, but if I couldn't afford to, I'd want them to go to the best school that they can do. And so he was saying, so why shouldn't we have grammar schools? Why shouldn't we kind of separate? I'm paraphrasing, these weren't his words, but separate the wheat from the chaff and allow them to be educated in a school that's going to get them further, in a school that's going to push them further, and let them shine in a school that is able to do that. And if that's the case, why can't we do that for more kids? Why shouldn't that be across the country where that is an option for kids? When you consider that from a parent's point of view, there's a very powerful argument. If you think your kid is clever enough, you don't want them to be in a school where you don't think they're going to get the best education that's going to help them the best, to provide them with an education. It leaves aside the fact that one of the biggest impacts on a child's outcomes in school is their parents. Not the school itself.
What your man there on the train is saying isn't an unusual opinion. A lot of people,
absolutely,
who, if they're not education specialists, or if they're not interested, if they don't, if you're just basically a layperson, you might think that might be the case, and a lot of people think that. And I don't think that's an unusual opinion. And it's partly what inspired the title of the blog which I write, which is called Icing on the Cake, which is my core thing which I want to get across to people and to say is that school provides the icing on the cake.
Mm-hmm.
But that cake is big, and the cake is the community and your parents and who's bringing you up and how you've been brought up by your peers and all the rest of it. And the icing is provided by schools on the cake there. But a lot of people do think that schools make a lot of difference, partly because that's been the political narrative for a long time, that schools make all the difference.
Well, we spend a lot of money on schools, so they make some difference.
It's something that the government control, and the government can blame the schools. And they can blame the economic situation, but politically, blaming the parents in any way whatsoever, that's not a good thing to do. So they're not going to say to people, genuinely, it's down to you, really. They're not going to say that. And also, there's a lot of things around that, that we can talk about that. But that opinion that the guy is saying, is not unusual.
No.
The problem with it, again, is that we. I think it's down to people like us who have taken an interest in these things and who are talking to, influential government people and making our voices heard to say, actually, no, come on, we have had this discussion now. We've said that we want to be an evidence-informed profession. And we can't just go with gut feel. So therefore, let's have a look at what the evidence says. There's a piece by Natalie Pereira, and she did a bit earlier this month about conclusions from the data. And she was saying there that pupils who attend grammar schools, they don't do any better than similar pupils, so similar kinds of pupils in high-performing comprehensives. So basically, if you put, all those children in Kent who end up going to those super selective or selective grammar schools, if they didn't go to grammar schools, which they don't in loads of other places, London, for example, where everybody keeps hearing about this, but other areas as well, those children do really well in those schools because they cook the cake, basically. So the kids are coming in, and you've got children coming into your school who are, who've got the smarts and the drive behind them, and people want them to succeed and so on. And they help everybody else,
Mm-hmm.
And the thing which the comprehensives do, which the grammar schools can't do, is that the comprehensives also help the middle attainers and the low attainers in the system generally. And the grammar schools can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, again, there's plenty of evidence to say that the grammar schools actually negatively affect that. Yes, children in grammar schools do well, but those children were going to do well anyway. Well, you can't argue with people's gut feeling that way,
Absolutely.
but you can present the data to them and say, and the facts and say, I can see that. And if it is just about your child, you as a parent, nobody's going to argue with you doing the best thing for your child.
No.
But if we're talking about at a government level of saying we need to support everybody's children, then surely that we have to support everybody's children. And again, government is the art of the possible and the art of the compromise.
Are there any other points that you'd like to make in closing?
I'd really love to find somebody, and if you can find somebody that we could hear, just tell us why we should have more grammar schools. I'd love to hear.
We will put the call out.
Fascinating.
We will put the call out. Thank you, Jack. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We will be in touch, I'm sure, again. Just if we have any other topics that need your insightful analysis. It's been
great.
A pleasure chatting to you.
anybody wants to have a further conversation with me, then I'm on Twitter at Jack_Marwood. You can find my blog, which is Icing on the Cake blog. You can look for me, and I'm sure it'll be in the show notes here.
We will put them in those show
notes. More than
notes.
happy to have the conversation with anybody.
Thank you very much, Jack.
What I liked about Jack's interview was the way he talked about the metaphor of icing on the cake. I really do urge people to listen to that metaphor, because that's what his blog is called, and it really does make sense. It underlines and sort of permeates everything he does. Mm-hmm. So when you talk to the guy on the train, or the average person, who's the average punter who's into education, sure, they want the best for their children, but do they really know what a grammar school looks like in this modern day and age, where you've got this skill set that's needed, a higher skill set for the average person in the population? Is it best fit? Should we call it a grammar school? Should we call it something else? How should we look at the data to do that? It's very, very complex. So it's great that you'd want your child to go to the best school possible, as everyone would. But when it comes to the realities, the sentiment doesn't match up with the sort of the way things are in the landscape across the country. And I think that's the important thing to hold on to with people. Mm-hmm. I'd love my child to go to the best school possible. He did. I mean, he didn't get any tutoring. He went to a really good school and he did really well. But, again, he's very with it. And I, when he was younger, was thinking, well, no, it must just be me thinking my kid's really great. But he was, it turned out, in that sense. If your child is not so gifted or has that determination to do well, can you make those judgments, and will they fail, or will the whole system collapse around you? It's very hard. It's very hard to make those judgments as a parent, because you want the best for your child and you think your child can do the best that they can. You want to be sure that you're not fooling yourself. Do you see that argument? It's a hard one. I mean, in my case, I thought, oh God, he's doing really well academically, and I'm hardly giving him any input here. And he kept on doing really well academically. So I thought Absolutely. My judgment was flawed, but it didn't seem to be in the end for some strange reason. But I'm lucky. I'm lucky in that respect. Not everyone is that lucky in that respect, if you see what I mean. So yes, you, as you say, the guy who was in the first class carriage said he wanted his child, he paid for their education. He wants the best for them possible. And will tutor them to the nth degree. And they'll probably get lots of cultural input, and they probably go on marvellous holidays and go to museums and do all that kind of thing. But in this landscape, which institution is the best place to get your child to the best academic space, or wherever? I mean, we had a very interesting discussion about UTCs and how they've more or less fallen by the wayside, as did the technical colleges many years ago. Yeah. So this kind of vocational education thing is a difficult one as well, because it doesn't seem to work within this context. It does in other countries, not in this one. So it's a very, very, very complex issue.
It is.
Yeah, and the thing about that is that it's sentiment over data. Again and again. I had a particular experience at the grammar school, and I reckon someone could have had a completely different experience, as I said to Becky, at the same grammar school, from where we came from different ends of the social spectrum into that one school, and all the baggage we brought with us. And then you take that experience on with you for the rest of your life, in that sense. So it colours maybe your opinions on those schools, whereas it shouldn't be your personal anecdotes or your personal experience, no matter how bound in they are, and your families. You should be try to be a bit more objective, especially if you're trying to create policy. So you do have parents and their wishes. The problem, I think, and it's the nub of this show, is if you claim to speak for parents and you appeal to that sentiment by using or twisting or making a talk on the stats, by simplifying and being selective and making sure that it feeds a certain interpretation or sentiment. And that for me is a problem. I find that is a big problem for me.
And I wonder if we're simply being naive, and that's just the way politics works. Of course, I think the answer to that my question there is undoubtedly yes. That is the way politics works. Of course, it is. Tim Loynig said at Research Ed that all of the stats that they have claimed, all of the claims they've made, can be shown to be true. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most appropriate. That it's the most appropriate use of that data. And as the letter from the UK Stats Authority says, that the DFE are making claim, certainly in those two claims that they made, where the statistics just are not borne out by the actual truth on the ground.
Again, to take another analogy, it's like one of those pictures where there's a little circle to show you a small part of the picture, and as you zoom out, you gradually get the whole context of the whole picture.
I'm reminded of all the hilarious videos of Catchphrase with Roy Walker, where I forget, is it Dusty Bin? No, that's something else. Anyway, the characters usually. The YouTube videos that are left are ones where he's making rude gestures, and it turns out no, he's actually just pumping up an airbed or something. But yeah, absolutely, we're not getting the full picture when they use these selective statistics. There's another part of me as well that's really concerned about this idea that we're saying parents want this.
Yeah,
parents want their kids to go to a good school. Let's be honest, most of them don't mind whether that's a grammar school or don't care whether that's a grammar school. They want their kids to go to a school where it's a well thought of school, it's getting good results, the kids are happy there.
Well behaved.
The type of school is irrelevant.
Yep.
The only difficulty with that is there will be a minority of parents that do argue for grammar school education because maybe that's what they remembered or they think it's a good thing. And I'm just a bit concerned that we have policy dictated by a minority. And the role of government has got to be, especially in this day and age where we're having lots of things happening to this country where effectively it's a minority of people in the country who are saying it. Whether it's a large minority or a small minority, it's still a minority of the electorate who are making the claim that we should leave Brexit, who are saying that we want grammar schools. And the government has a responsibility, I don't want to make this about Brexit, but the government has a responsibility to think about the country as a whole and what is good for children as a whole. It shouldn't be, and Jack made this point as well, I think will be in the full interview, but it shouldn't be catering to a small percentage of parents and children at the expense of other children as well.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I think the point is that if you look at the news even today, where they talk about the untouchable schools, the ones who have failed and cannot get a sponsor for an academy, and no one's going near them. Teachers, no one wants to touch them. They're basically sink schools, and they're not being sort of pulled out of the mire. So I mean that. In some senses, it should be a priority, and if that's failing, and then you're trying to put a grammar school in there, and they're failing because financially as well, because if they're in a chain, people don't want them in a chain because they'll pull the whole chain down financially.
And so the news in the mini budgets Wednesday sticks in the craw as well, because there's been capital expenditure allocated for expansion of grammar schools before the consultation is even completed. Okay, fair enough. Some people have said, well, they have to kind of earmark it if they're going to use it. Fine. But nothing else for any of these other schools that are not going to be improved by grammar schools? Good schools for all means concentrating on the schools that are having difficulties. It does not mean putting in selective schools for the kids that, if they're already going to good schools, they're getting a good enough education anyway, and they are being stretched in good, comprehensive schools. And if they're not, the law of unintended consequences says we don't know what the effect of putting a grammar school is. I think the example Becky used was in Knowsley, or any other area where the schools are suffering because they haven't got enough funding.
Yeah.
The argument might be that, well, we'll fund a grammar school to put in that area, but the DfE do not know what the effect of that will be on other schools in the area. It's our gut feeling, and the statistics seem to suggest that it will not be a positive effect, whether that's through churn of teachers or teachers moving to teach in the grammar school from that area, whether it's to do with students coming from outside the area into the grammar school and so not enough places going to the local kids that need it. Whatever the reason, there's no evidence to say, whatever the reason, there's very little evidence to say that this is definitely the way to go, and yet this seems to be what they're putting all their chips on.
And I mean, they do say things like they expect grammar schools to sort of reach out and collaborate with other schools, but we never see any cast iron, positive things about this. So,
sorry, Liam, they've been asking universities to support local schools. They've been asking independent schools to support local schools as part of this policy. The universities and the independent schools up and down the country are saying, we either do stuff more than we can afford to do at the moment anyway, or no, we're not interested, thank you very much.
Yeah, and the main thing I think really is to think about all the issues in this programme and go and fill in that form, but maybe not as Jacob Marley or Ebenezer Scrooge.
As Tim Loynig said, be kind, courteous, give evidence, give your reasoned opinion, and don't swear at them, because if you swear at them, they're going to chuck it out and ignore it. Don't fill it in under a false name. Put your opinions. If that opinion is positive for grammar schools, so be it. Sell those grammar schools to the DfE. But if it's not, and the vast majority of people that I speak to, and maybe it's a bias, but that I speak to, are not happy about this policy. It is not a policy that has any... I've said that. I'm not happy about this policy. We'll leave it there.
And to get on to something far more positive,
Yay!
We'll end the programme with a think piece, or sort of looking at how one teacher is using... I can't find it. Where is it? Where have you put it?
I haven't put it anywhere.
All right. Yeah. To end this on a more positive note, we've got one teacher, Dr. Nikki Kaiser, talking about how she's used science journals with her class. And I remember at Research Ed, at the very first meeting of Research Ed at the conference and at the national conference, the idea of science journals was raised between teachers, but this is someone who's using science journals with their class, and it's a lovely look into how the whole thing works.
A year or so ago, I started a science journal club for students at our school. There was a few reasons for this. I'm interested in research anyway. I was in research before I came into teaching, but also I was acting as a Key Stage 5 lead for chemistry at the time, and we were looking for ways to develop and stretch our A to A star students. So it was something that I thought about. Then I read an article in the RSC, the Royal Society of Chemistry, Education in Chemistry blog by Ben Rogers, and it was a really good article about the importance of literacy in science, but not just literacy in science, but science literacy, that students being able to read about science and interpret what they see. And he talked about how important it is to science and engineering professionals, but how most of them weren't taught how to read science at university, let alone at school. So I decided to bite the bullet in October last year, and we looked at a paper from a local researcher called Johannes Lauber, who's in the School of Environmental Sciences at UEA, and it had been published the year before, and it had sparked quite a lot of media interest. So I thought it was quite a good one to look at how it was reported in the media and compared to how the research was actually reported in the original paper. Also, it was a Nature paper, and they're relatively short and they're quite readable actually, so it was a really nice one to start with. We even had a radio interview with Johannes on the Today programme on Radio 4, so it was a really good start to the club. And I had no idea how it would go, didn't know if anyone would turn up, but we had a good, I can't remember, at least 10 or so people at the first group. And the pupils had actually read the paper in advance and they'd come along with some really good questions. What I didn't expect was how much of the session was going to be them talking to Johannes about his career and the research in itself, so what he does day to day and how the paper was put together, and this careers aspect has been quite a big aspect of the groups, and it's something I feel quite strongly about actually, that that students don't categorise themselves too early. I was convinced I was going to be a musician when I was studying for my A-levels, and but somehow ended up doing a degree in chemistry. I started 2 PhDs actually in slightly different topics, finished a second one, and my postdoc was in marine biogeochemistry, and that I think has become quite a common theme, that as long as you've got a good degree behind you and you're interested in it, then it gives you a really wide range of options. And there was actually a talk last year at the Teachers and Advisors Conference for UEA where the CEO of UCAS, Mary Kernock-Cook, talked about how we as teachers should be trying to widen the aspirations and the choices of our students. Apparently 75% of the choices that go for UCAS applications were for 25% of their courses last year. So she was saying that just because students want to do medicine, whatever that means, it doesn't mean that they have to study medicine. They don't have to be doctors to work in medicine. And again, that was something that really came up quite a lot in our journal club. For example, Dan Brewer came to talk to us, and he works in UEA Medical School for the Cancer Research Institute. But his original degree was actually in physics at Imperial College, and he only kind of converted, I guess, to a bio scientist later, or trained in that aspect later. We don't always have external visitors. So, for example, one of the really nice journal clubs was led by one of my colleagues after he'd listened to the Life Scientific programme on Radio 4 about Nick Lane, who's a science author, and he talked about a couple of the books that he'd read by him, and that was a really nice session. When we do have external visitors, it's not just good to kind of look at the reading process itself and to talk about the science behind it, but it gives students a real insight into the research process as well. So, for example, when Grant Forster came in and talked to us about fern air, which is the air that gets trapped in snow in Greenland, and how they could use that to find out what was in the air 60 years ago. He talked as well about how many groups of scientists from all over the world kind of collaborated and put their research together and checked the reliability and so on, and it all fed into this one paper. And then on the other hand, there was Andy Round, who came from the chemistry department at UEA, who told us about some research into nanoparticles that could have some really exciting implications for cancer treatment. And this whole research project stemmed from a conversation they had over coffee, and then they decided to get together and look at things together. So it's a really nice insight for students into what goes on in research. In terms of aspect, I would say we always have at least 10 pupils there. 10 pupils would be a bad day, but usually we have, sometimes we'll have 20 or so, especially if it's a subject that sounds like it's medical, then we often get more than 20. And so, it's helpful for them in terms of, I guess, their interviews for university. They can talk about real research that they've genuinely read and they know something about and they're interested in. Anecdotally, I think it's given students ideas about career paths they might not have thought about otherwise. But I think my proudest moment was in the most recent meeting when I asked one of my Year 13s to talk to the Year 12s about how she reads research papers, and I hadn't told her I was going to do this in advance. She hadn't planned for it at all, and it was just so lovely to listen to her talking about the process of how she reads the abstract and looks at the introduction, and then she goes to the conclusion, and then she'll go back and she brought her paper along and she'd highlighted all the words she didn't understand, and she looks them up in a dictionary, and then she looks at the figures and she tries to work out how they relate to everything, and she looks at the methodology, and it was just a wonderful insight. And so I think, yes, for the people that come along, we have helped them with their confidence, with their scientific literacy, and hopefully we've introduced them to areas of science and stories that they wouldn't otherwise have come across.
I think that's brilliant, Leon. I've got a friend, Sarah Pannell, who I used to do the science TV guide with, who was a big advocate for that sort of thing as well in the classroom. We've discussed it quite a bit in the ASE chat online, and I just think certainly for A-level students it's such an effective way of engaging with science.
I think at any level, because even at primary people used to bring in their rocks and talk at length about things like that, or actually using Skype to contact scientists and have a Q&A session.
There's also the brilliant Researchers in Schools group that send PhD students into schools to work with kids. It's a brilliant way, I think, of engaging students in their subject outside of the expertise that a teacher can bring to it.
And that is a very positive end, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we'd just like to say thank you again to Innovate My School, who's a strategic partner, where you can also get our podcast, and Aston Microphones. And we're still looking, or we are involved in negotiations with other sponsors. We pay people for the reviews. We do payment for think pieces. So we do need money coming in for sponsorship. It would help us a lot.
Okay, Leon. Hope you all enjoyed the show today. And we will see you in a fortnight when we will not be waxing lyrical on grammar schools, I promise.
I think we've done that to death, but do go and fill the form in. See you all now.
Bye.